For years, business success was defined by one word: growth. Grow faster, grow bigger, grow at any cost. That was the dominant mindset. If your company was expanding, gaining users, increasing revenue, you were winning. Everything else could be figured out later. But today, that mindset is being challenged. Because behind every fast-growing business, there's a trade-off that rarely gets talked about: growth versus control. And the more a company leans into one, the more it often sacrifices the other. At first, this trade-off isn't obvious. Growth feels positive. It brings momentum, attention, and opportunity. It attracts investors, builds brand recognition, and creates the perception of success. But growth also introduces complexity. More customers mean more expectations. More products mean more moving parts. More markets mean more uncertainty. And as complexity increases, control starts to weaken. This is where the tension begins. Because controlling a business, really understanding it, managing it, and keeping it efficient, becomes harder as it grows. Think about what happens inside a fast-scaling company. Decisions have to be made quickly. Processes are often built on the fly. Teams expand rapidly, sometimes faster than the systems that support them. In the early stages, this can work. Speed matters, flexibility matters, and a bit of chaos can even be helpful. But over time, that chaos starts to create problems. Costs become harder to track. Inefficiencies start to build. Communication breaks down. And suddenly, the company is growing, but it's not fully in control of how it's growing. This is something many businesses only realize later. Because growth can hide problems. When revenue is increasing quickly, it's easy to overlook inefficiencies. Losses feel manageable. Weak systems can be ignored. But once growth slows down, those hidden issues become visible. And that's when the lack of control becomes a real risk. This is why more businesses are starting to rethink how they grow. They're asking a different question. Not just how fast can we grow, but how much control are we maintaining as we grow? Because without control, growth becomes fragile. It depends too much on external conditions. It becomes harder to predict. And when something goes wrong, the impact is larger. On the other hand, focusing too much on control has its own downside. If a company becomes overly cautious, overly structured, it can slow down. Opportunities get missed, innovation becomes harder, decision-making becomes slower, and in competitive markets, moving too slowly can be just as dangerous as moving too fast. So this is the real trade-off. Growth gives you speed, momentum, and scale. Control gives you stability, efficiency, and clarity, and businesses have to constantly balance the two. But here's where it gets interesting. In the past, the balance leaned heavily toward growth. Companies were willing to sacrifice control in exchange for speed. The assumption was that once they reached scale, they could fix the problems later. But that approach is becoming less viable. Because today's environment is less forgiving. Costs are higher, competition is stronger, and mistakes are more expensive. So companies are shifting. They're starting to prioritize control earlier. You can see this in how businesses are operating now. They're being more careful with hiring. They're paying closer attention to margins. They're investing in systems and processes sooner. Instead of growing first and organizing later, they're trying to do both at the same time. And that's not easy, because maintaining control while growing requires discipline. It requires saying no to opportunities that don't align. It requires building systems before they're urgently needed. It requires slowing down in certain areas to avoid bigger problems later. These are not intuitive decisions, especially in a culture that still celebrates rapid growth. But the companies that manage this balance will tend to perform better over time. Because they're not just growing, they're growing in a way that is sustainable. And sustainability is becoming more important. Investors are paying closer attention to fundamentals. Profitability, efficiency, and cash flow matter more than they used to. This reinforces the importance of control. Because control is what allows a business to manage costs, optimize operations, and maintain performance even when conditions change. But there's also a strategic layer to this. Control is not just about internal operations, it's also about external positioning. Companies that maintain control over their pricing, their supply chains, their customer relationships, they have more flexibility. They can adapt more easily. They can make decisions from a position of strength. Whereas companies that grow too quickly without control often become dependent on external funding, dependent on aggressive marketing, dependent on constant expansion just to sustain themselves. And that kind of dependency is risky. So the conversation around growth is changing. It's no longer just about how much you grow. It's about how well you manage that growth. This is why you're seeing more businesses talk about quality of growth. Growth that is profitable, growth that is efficient, growth that can be sustained. Because not all growth is equal. Some growth strengthens a business. Other growth stretches it too thin. And the difference often comes down to control. But here's the part that makes this trade-off difficult. There is no perfect balance. Every business has to find its own point. Some industries require faster growth, others reward stability. Some moments call for aggressive expansion, others require tightening control.